Oh man, so Evergrande have an $83 million interest payment due on Thursday. And could this just be the start of the stock market correction? So on Thursday, Evergrande have 83 million due on 5-year US dollar denominated government bonds, right? So they need to pay the interest of 83 million by Thursday. The initial offering of that bond was about 2 billion. So the interest payment is 83 million and that's due on Thursday. And they look like they are going to default on that. They're going to miss that payment. Now, another payment on a 7-year bond is then due next Thursday. So you can see this is starting to really pile up on Evergrande, and it's really starting to get investors and particularly those invested in Evergrande really nervous. Now, the yields, you can see the yields on the 5-year bond, not that anybody's buying these right now off Evergrande. If I move me out the way, you can see the yield has skyrocketed over 500% on yields for Evergrande. Obviously, nobody's touching them. That is a bit of a problem. Now, what does this mean? So we know that this doesn't mean that Evergrande technically default. If they miss the payment on Thursday, this doesn't necessarily equate to a default. They would have to not pay for over 30 days to technically go to default, although the market's already priced in and they know that they're going to default. Now, what does this mean for the Chinese government? Well, the Chinese government, can they afford to let Evergrande fail? I mean, the biggest issue we have here are twofold. One, you've got about 1 million homes paid for by by civilians in China that have pre-bought these homes. So the Chinese government cannot risk, and we've already seen some protests from civilians coming out and protesting outside of the HQ of Evergrande. Can the CCP afford to have such an negative propaganda going around this fallout? That would be a terrible vision. That would be a terrible outcome for Xi Jinping. Now, on top of that, so that's a one thing in terms of building those houses and delivering on the people that have paid their life savings for these houses. The other thing is it could collapse the financial system of the second biggest economy in the world. So Evergrande owe up to 171 domestic banks. So they owe debt to 171 domestic banks and 121 other financial firms. Now, that means if they were to default, right? So if they do not pay these 290 odd firms what they are owed, these financial firms will be forced to lend out less. And that means businesses, consumers will not be able to borrow as easily. This is what's referred to as a credit crunch. This is what we saw in 2008 with the Lehman crisis. And this will not be good look for China, especially in a fragile time with the Delta variant, with COVID and the economy just starting to recover, the global economy just starting to recover. Can China afford to let Evergrande fall out? Not only mean that we don't deliver on the houses for the civilians, the residents, but also the fact that 290 odd firms will be directly affected, and therefore that can lead to a credit crunch. Now, what would this mean for offshore investors? So we have something called cross default. Now, this has people thinking that China might start, the CCP may start to come up with a clever idea for how to get out of this mess. Some are saying that Evergrande should not rely on the CCP to get bailed out. They should figure this out on their own. But others are saying, this is nothing for China. They're going to print 300 billion of debt. They'll print it out, pay it off, and avert the disaster. But I don't think it's as simple as that. You've got to remember the political angle of this. Xi Jinping is trying to override this debt-ridden culture in China. That's how Evergrande got into this position in the first place. Xi Jinping put a bunch of rules in place to say you cannot be this leveraged. Evergrande then went out and started selling their assets, i.e. the properties they've built, for less than par. And when because they wanted cash to come in, so their ratio wasn't as leveraged. But in doing so, they then messed up their finances, their cash flow, and they're unable to now make their interest payments. That's what's happened, right? That's how we're in this mess now, where they've got 300 billion in debt looking to be written off. So it's got China thinking, well, it's got some people thinking that China may just find a halfway home. They may find a way to take care of the core business of Evergrande, let other bits fall away, and make sure that they can deliver the 1 million homes. So kind of prop it up, but not the whole way. And I think that is probably what we're going to end up with. So you can see there's something called cross cross default. That's what it's called, cross default. So you have offshore bond denominated in US dollars, right? Which is how you have your offshore investors invested in. And then you have your onshore yuan denominated bonds. These are what more Chinese retail investors will be holding on to, right? Just as you and I may hold Western company bonds here in our native currencies, the Chinese retail investors and their institutions will be buying in yuan denominated bonds. So they're onshore Evergrande debt. Now, what we're saying here is if you default on your onshore, your yuan denominated debt, that automatically triggers a default on all your offshore debt as well. However, if you default on your offshore debt, that does not necessarily trigger a default on your onshore. So this has some people coming up with the idea that perhaps China may do that. They may ask Evergrande to default on their offshore, and this could have massive implications for a lot of the US firms, okay? And that's why we're seeing a scare in the S&P, and the futures are still down, because you've got the likes of Fidelity, UBS, PIMCO, Alliance, BlackRock, all picking up a lot of Evergrande debt between July and August, right? Because they saw the attractive valuations, they saw the increasing spreads, and they piled in on Evergrande, and it was such bad timing. So if China were to default on those bonds first, the offshore bonds, and only the offshore bond, they keep operating with their onshore. They don't default on their onshore. They manage those payments. Maybe the government helps them manage those payments. Then we could see this crisis averted for China. But what does that, and where does that leave the US? Because this is the problem here. If they default on all the foreign investments, that could be a big problem. It will solve the issue for China because they'll keep the core of Evergrande up. They'll build the homes. Residents will be happy. They've got their homes back, which they paid for. The 200 local domestic firms, financial firms, and banks will be happy. They're still getting paid their yuan back. And it's just the offshore that suffers. Now, a lot of this will depend on the value. How much is offshore versus onshore? I don't have that data to hand. And that's how it's going to play out. But that is one possibility which we could see. Now, the other thing to remember is this is, Evergrande accounts for 11% of all the high yield bonds available in Asia. Not just China, in Asia. So this is a big deal, and this is definitely a tricky one for Xi Jinping. If he steps out and he resolves this problem for them completely, then a lot of his work in terms of unwinding debt and bad leverage practice is going to be undone, because other companies, Evergrande's competitors, other companies in other verticals will look around and say, hang on a second, Evergrande got away with it. We're bigger than Evergrande, so we can do what we want. We're just going to get bailed out, right? They've set a precedence. Whereas if they just let them fall, then we've got the massive impact it could have on the financial crisis and the delicate recovery we're in post-COVID. So yeah, Xi Jinping's not in a good position. And I think that's what's got me thinking around this kind of halfway house. He doesn't want to fully bail out because that'll just set a bad precedence, but he also doesn't want to ignore it. So I can see him coming up with something creative. And now it's just about what kind of timelines are we going to see? Are they going to let them default on Thursday, or are they going to resolve it beforehand? Are they going to let it get to the next payment, which is next Wednesday on the 29th of September? It's going to be interesting. I mean, also we've got the FOMC meeting today and tomorrow. I think this is overshadowing that, although any talk of taper could easily flip the market even more. So it's a very delicate market right now, and I don't think, well, Jerome Powell's done it before, but I don't think he'll rock the market too soon. Hopefully he keeps it low key, doesn't announce anything silly, not too much hawkish talk, just more of the same of what we heard from him over the last few months, and that should get us through this. But there's your update on Evergrande. Important payment due on Thursday, which everybody's going to be looking out towards to see if they can make that payment, or if China swoop in like an eagle and solve the issue, or are they going to kick the can down the road and let this propagate for longer? If this propagates for longer and we go into next week without any certainty, that's not going to be good for the market. We're going to see the VIX continue to increase, and that won't be good. Let's take a quick look at the VIX before we head off. See if I can pull up the VIX. Right, there you go. So we can see that's where we're at on the VIX. If I go to the 4-hourly, and we can see from when we made the videos yesterday, we had highs up here of 29. We're settling down at 22.97 right now, but it'd be interesting to see where do we open back up at. We want to see this down, and this volatility is going to tick up, and it's not going to just steadily increase. But as and when we get more data or lack of data, that can spook the market. And the VIX is always a good gauge of how spooked the market is. So we always know this. Markets want certainty. Markets will always be looking for certainty. They want to know where we're heading and how we're heading there. So any lack of information or any confusion or ambiguity can spook the market and see a down day in S&P, NASDAQ, and Dow. So there you go, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. I will update you if there are any more developments on Evergrande, and we will see you in the next one.